this week in Lomé. But now to the topic, emerging transitions and changes of power. These transitions and changes of power on the continent have serious implications for TJ, have serious implications for transitional justice. We have two types of transitions, government transitions, on our continent. We have had normal transitions that are constitutional, that come through elections where a new government replaces the old one. Let's call that constitutional transitions. They enhance democracy, they enhance peace in most instances, and therefore they play a positive role to transitional justice. So we need to see how to safeguard those types of constitutional transitions. These are the types of transitions that are permissible by our AU Democracy Treaty, the 2007 African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, in particular Article 10 of the Charter and Article 23 of the Charter. And then you have another type of transitions. The first type is constitutional. They are aligned to democratic practice. So they come through respect for the Constitution and elections. Democratic, credible, and peaceful elections. That's the type we want for TJ. TJ requires such as Mali twice, Guinea, Sudan twice also, Burkina Faso. We've had attempted coups in Guinea-Bissau and Niger. We've had coups that are not. You find it difficult to actually say it's a coup in certain instances. But this is a trend that needs to be avoided. It endangers democracy. It endangers peace and security. It also endangers success of the AUTJ policy. So these are the issues that, for me, I think they're important for us to tackle during this session. What type of transitions are we talking about? Are those transitions enhance or undermine democracy, peace, and security? And what are the implications then for the AUTJ policy? So I'm expecting my panelists to interrogate those and other related issues. They have the liberty to take any direction so long as it addresses the topic. But that's my introductory remarks. Moderator, allow me now to introduce the panel that we have. And fortunately, I'm told that their detailed biographies are provided with the overall package that we provided, what was provided to all the participants. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction of each one of them, and then call them in that order to make their presentations. The first will be Madam Ms. Roslyn Hanzi. Ms. Roslyn Hanzi is the Executive Director of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, ZLHR, an NGO that has for long been working for human rights, protection and promotion in Zimbabwe. You are welcome, Madam. And we have Professor Solomon Derso. Dr. Solomon Derso is the member of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, a premier human rights organ of our union. And I'm sure he's joining us online. Can you confirm that he is with us? Commissioner? Excellency, confirm you're with us? While he's connecting, let me proceed without any further ado to introduce Advocate Alan Gary. Professor Advocate Alan Gary is the program head for advocacy at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. At the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in South Africa. And I would like to stop there with the intros. The detailed introductions are provided in your packs. So I don't want to take a lot of your time introducing them. I'm eager to get them going. So without any further ado, let me call on one of them at a time to deliver their presentations. I think 5 to 7 minutes. That's what I've been guided to allocate. Correct me if I'm wrong. 5 to 7 minutes each. So I'll start with Ms. Roslyn Hanzi. Madame Roslyn, over to you.
Thank you, Prof, and good afternoon, everyone. I know this is the graveyard session. After the lunch, I hope we're going to manage to keep you awake. I am going to be talking about the Zimbabwean experience to some extent, and then linking it to developments on the continent to see how we can address this issue of unconstitutional bodies of government. The implications on these emerging trends, and how it affects development and social transformation. In November 2017, Zimbabwe went through a very unusual transition, which those who were fronting called a military-assisted transition. And I think when Professor was introducing the types of transition, he did say that in some instances, we have had what we call outright coup d'etats. And then in some instances, you can't really tell what's happening because it's a coup that does not appear to be a coup because of events that follow. And for Zimbabwe, actually, there was a lot of debate around what it was, what type of transition we underwent in November 2017. For those who are scholars in political science and who have been studying the occurrence of coup d'etats in Africa, for those who had studied the coup d'etat that ousted Mobutu Sese Seko, they would say that the circumstances in the events of November in Zimbabwe were similar to what happened to Mobutu Sese Seko in the then Zaire. And then for some, they'll say, no, it was a military assisted transition. It's a debate for another day. But there was some transition. For Zimbabwe, the citizens were used as a front to make it a popular revolution, and they did actually go ahead because they were tired of having the same person ruling the country for 37 years. There were popular scenes that were captured for the first time on national and international media. One of the main issues that we see in Zimbabwe and in other countries in Africa is that there seems to be some sentiments by some ruling parties that power cannot change, particularly where there are revolutionary liberation governments. The argument has always been that if they cease to rule or if they cede power to other political parties, particularly the opposition, then this can lead to recolonialization of the countries. But one of the main challenges that I see with that argument is that issues of decolonialization have already been addressed by the United Nations from as far back as 1960, where the position of the United Nations has been clear in the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, that they would not be tolerating recolonialization of African countries. The emerging issue that we see on the continent is the issue of neo-colonialization, particularly if we look at the role of the East, China, for example, on the continent, and it's something that the African Union needs to look at, where there's a lot of exploitation of natural resources. That is actually supposed to be redistributed for the benefit of the people of the continent. It's an area that still needs to be addressed, and I think when we look at the transitional justice policy framework that has been developed by the African Union, it's something that has not really been anticipated. That needs to be addressed. We cannot really discuss issues of transition in Zimbabwe and the implications on development, social transformation, and long-lasting peace without looking at the history of the country. Zimbabwe was born out of a liberation struggle that was protracted. In 1979, towards the end of that year, when some of us came to this world, there was a negotiated political settlement with sunset clauses. The main reason why my forefathers, my ancestors, went to war was because of the land issue. And then you get into a negotiated political settlement where there are sunset clauses around how you deal with the land. And then we fast forward to 2000, and then issues of land become expedient in terms of redistributing because of an emerging strong opposition. And of course, the redistribution is not very well planned, it's chaotic, and it does not really achieve what it is supposed to achieve. If we now fast forward to 2019 February, we now have the African Union adopting the Transitional Justice Policy document, which also sets out issues around redistributive social and economic justice, looking at issues to do with the land reform. Zimbabwe presents a lesson for most African countries. We see issues of land being discussed in other countries like South Africa, in other countries on the continent around redistribution, but Zimbabwe presents an example of what not to do when it comes to land reform. There needs to be a clear framework that is time-bound, and there has to be an end and a start to the land reform program. Otherwise, it will not achieve what it has to achieve. One of the main challenges that we
des terres, il y a eu un autre problème d'allocation de terres. La majorité de la population pauvre n'a pas eu accès aux terres et la minorité, l'élite, a eu accès à des centaines d'hectares de terres arables et souvent ces terres ne sont même pas utilisées à bon escient. Lorsqu'on parle de transition, de cohésion sociale et de développement, il faut parler de réforme institutionnelle. Au Zimbabwe, on a un programme de réforme des terres et en termes de protection des intérêts de personnes en charge de ces programmes. Malheureusement, ces personnes ne peuvent pas bénéficier de l'aide du système de justice. Aussi, il y a un manque de réformes législatives qui pourraient conduire à plus de transformations sociales dans le pays. J'aimerais parler de la constitution adoptée par le Zimbabwe en 2020 qui sert à légitimer la transition militaire. Donc après le coup, on a vu qu'on a une société plutôt polarisée. Nous avons des lois qui ne sont pas encore mises en œuvre et que si ces lois plutôt sont mises en œuvre, il y aura un avancement en termes d'état de droit et de respect des droits de l'homme. Il y a aussi le rôle de l'Union africaine et la SADC. En 2017, avant la transition, il y a eu plusieurs événements qui ont eu lieu. Après cela, il y a eu la transition et la plupart des citoyens ont pensé que l'Union africaine et la SADC n'ont pas assez fait pour militer en faveur des citoyens. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle les citoyens ont rejeté l'intervention de ces institutions sur le continent. Le Zimbabwe a rectifié certains instruments de l'Union africaine portant sur les droits de l'homme, la préservation de la démocratie, les élections et la gouvernance. Réformes institutionnelles et législatives dans nos différents pays, notamment au Zimbabwe. Je vous remercie. Thank you so much. Je vous remercie infiniment. Est-ce qu'on peut l'applaudir une fois de plus? Thank you. Merci infiniment. Intervention très pertinente. Je voulais que tout le monde fasse sa présentation et de faire des commentaires, mais je pense que ce serait mieux de faire mes commentaires au vif. Donc, je vais d'être en mesure les points clés que vous avez mentionnés dans votre présentation en ce qui concerne ce thème. Vous avez fait part d'un cas d'étude typiquement zimbabwéen. Vous nous avez rappelé la transition de 2017, une contestation populaire dont nous avons tous été témoins, bien sûr. Et après cela, il y a eu une intervention militaire et vous avez posé une question. Et je ne sais pas si vous avez répondu à cette question. Et la question nous avons ces zones grises que nous devons, des zones sur lesquelles il faut jeter davantage de lumière. Vous nous avez rappelé l'état économique critique de l'Afrique et vous avez parlé des conditions de néocolonialisme ou un nouveau type de néocolonialisme. Vous avez parlé du rôle de la Chine en Afrique, par exemple. Et on peut même parler d'autres pays, pas seulement la Chine. Il y a la Chine et les autres pays de l'Orient, le Qatar, les Émirats arabes unis. Ce sont de nouveaux acteurs. Il y a même l'Inde. Donc vous avez ces nouveaux acteurs. Et qu'est-ce que cela représente pour l'Afrique? C'est une question. Troisièmement, vous avez parlé du problème foncier. Le problème foncier est au cœur de notre économie africaine. Et c'est vrai, on ne peut pas avoir une justice redistributive selon les termes de l'Union africaine sans parler du foncier. C'est un point très pertinent et vous avez donné le cas d'étude du Zimbabwe. Quatrièmement, vous avez parlé du problème de l'Union africaine et de la SADC en termes de transition au Zimbabwe. Qu'ont fait l'Union africaine et la SADC en matière de cette transition? Et enfin, vous avez parlé du dilemme faisant référence à l'espace civique qui se rétrécit en Afrique et cela est une contrainte pour la société civile, surtout les organisations qui militent pour les droits de l'homme. Donc voilà les problèmes que vous avez soulevés. Je m'arrête ici et je donne la possibilité aux participants de poser la question lors du débat. Est-ce que je peux confirmer la présence du docteur en ligne? Est-ce que le commissaire Derso est en ligne? Il travaille à la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples et euh, nous partageons les mêmes postes au CVJR. Commissaire clés que vous aimeriez partager avec les participants. Vous avez la parole. Je vous remercie, professeur, de m'avoir introduit. Merci de m'avoir donné la parole. C'est un honneur d'être ici avec vous et partager nos idées en vue de résoudre les défis sur le continent en termes de justice traditionnelle. Et je me joins aux orateurs qui ont intervenu et qui ont partagé leur expérience sur comment faire avancer l'Afrique. Ma présentation est basée sur les transitions émergentes et je vais parler spécifiquement sur les menaces. Lorsqu'on parle de la mise en œuvre de la justice conditionnelle, oui, on vous reçoit, commissaire. Est-ce qu'on peut m'aider avec le son? Je ne reçois aucun son de la salle. Désolé d'avoir perturbé votre présentation. Est-ce que les techniciens peuvent nous aider? Je vous vois, mais je ne vous entends pas. Je suis sûr que les techniciens vont nous aider à trouver une solution. Je ferai mon commentaire à ma présentation en attendant que les techniciens ne résolvent ce problème et nous allons conclure le panel avec votre présentation. Donc, je disais que l'une des notions contestées dans la mise en œuvre de la justice transitionnelle est qu'il y a beaucoup de contestations. Et la question que l'on se pose est de savoir quand la justice traditionnelle pourrait être applicable dans des situations de post-conflit ou pendant les conflits. Dans plusieurs pays africains qui mettent en œuvre les mécanismes de justice traditionnelle, il y a des conflits en cours, des conflits au niveau des frontières des pays et des conflits qui vont au-delà de ces frontières. Et cela montre que la conceptualisation traditionnelle de la justice traditionnelle comme outil de reconstruction après les conflits n'est plus un outil adapté aux transitions émergentes sur le continent africain. Chaque région fait face à des défis qui affectent la sécurité et le bien-être des Africains. Dans certains cas, ces défis se passent dans des cas de transition politique et Madame Ranzi a parlé de la transition contestée au Zimbabwe. Mais d'un point de vue plus propre, l'extrémisme violent est devenu est le moteur central en termes de violence et de tension en Afrique du Centre, dans la Corne de l'Afrique et même dans la partie du sud de l'Afrique. Les résultats sont alarmants avec des milliers de morts, des victimes et un déplacement massif de personnes arrachées de leur maison dû aux violences. La justice conditionnelle où l'idée est piégée dans le silo faisant référence aux violations des droits de l'homme précédentes, dont les racines pourraient être les mêmes marginalisations qui sont à l'origine des conflits. En Afrique, le crime organisé sous les formes de trafic d'humains d'armes ou les autres marchés illicites affectent les institutions et affectent leur légitimité en affectant l'état de droit. Et cela permet à la corruption de gagner du terrain. Et ceci est visible dans tous les pays africains. Le crime organisé affecte la stabilité et le potentiel de croissance de l'Afrique qui est dévastateur dans les pays fragiles et il y a une économie fragile et des pays en transition. La plupart des pays africains ont des difficultés à contenir la menace grandissante des crimes organisés. L'approche au nord ne sied pas au contexte africain. De nouvelles menaces en Afrique nécessitent pays du Sahel, qui mettent cet État dans une fragilité perpétuelle. On peut donner le détail de cette approximative qui a créé des tensions entre le gouvernement et le groupe économique et les effets ricochés que cela a en termes d'économie violente. Nous voulons que les négociations dans la construction de la justice traditionnelle entre la liberté traditionnelle et le groupe religieux par exemple, ou le dialogue au Soudan entre la groupe armée et les combattants exilés pourrait être un exemple à suivre. Toute région à l'Afrique. De personnes, le corridor de TRANSITIONNELLE et le lien entre le crime organisé et la famille violente sont le moteur clé des conflits en cours et tout cela ravive les anciens conflits et entretient le conflit interethnique. Ceux qui suivent la nouvelle au Sahel entendent souvent parler de Fulani, des conflits entre les Fulani dans la région. Donc c'est un problème qui affecte les Africains et est un défi clé pour le développement et la transformation sociale. Le changement constitutionnel au niveau du gouvernement est un problème et l'un des orateurs a parlé du cadre normatif au sein de l'Union africaine et ce cadre n'a aucun appui et il est difficile. Rechercher la vérité dans les pratiques de ces multinationales, leur redevabilité font partie des négociations et le dialogue régional et national pour résoudre les conflits. Donc, pour conclure, la réponse isolée pour lutter contre la menace en Afrique et l'absence de discussion de la transition système de justice traditionnelle sans ces contributions ne pouvons pas avancer. Et pour avancer, il faut faire face à ces menaces multisectorielles qui affectent la transition politique et continuent de menacer le développement et la transformation sociale de l'Afrique et des Africains. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Est-ce qu'on peut l'applaudir, s'il vous plaît? Je vous remercie infiniment. Merci pour ce exposé très pertinent. Je pense que je prends du bon temps ici parce que le panéliste a fait un travail excellent. Et ils rendent la tâche facile parce qu'ils sont disciplinés et ils respectent le temps qu'ils ont alloué. Si j'étais allemand, j'allais demander seulement de prix. Moi, je suis dans ce pays. Donc, si vous voulez de prix, il ne faut pas qu'on se rencontre physiquement. Je suis fier de votre travail. On a fait une présentation pertinente et c'est un plat excellent qui vient de nous servir. On a décidé de se focaliser sur dans les atrocités et violences du passé est incapable de résoudre les problèmes actuels et éviter les conflits à l'avenir. J'aimerais que proposer une solution. Nous devons continuer à avoir des politiques de la justice traditionnelle, avoir penser à la justice traditionnelle comme un cycle. La justice traditionnelle s'applique tout d'abord durant la phase pré-conflit, comme mesure de prévention, dont la justice traditionnelle doit être appliquée durant le conflit, comme outil de gestion d'un conflit, tout d'abord comme outil de prévention et outil de gestion, peut être appliqué après le conflit comme faisant partie de la reconstruction et du développement. Donc n'oubliez pas que l'Union africaine commence à voter une politique sur la reconstruction et le développement d'un conflit et cela a construit au centre de reconstruction d'Asie en Égypte. Et la justice traditionnelle est une composante majeure de cette activité. Donc, je peux continuer. Avant le conflit, prévenir le conflit, gérer le conflit, reconstruire. Transition et développement pour la justice traditionnelle. Ça, il a dit de manière claire et nette. Deuxièmement, il a parlé des États. Et la troisième a fait référence au crime organisé.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Commissioner Derso, take the floor. I can't hear him.
Can you hear me now?
Commissioner, please take the floor for 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Commissioner, he's
I
talking,
can
but
hear
I can't hear him. Are you able to hear him? To hear him from Lome?
Looks like that Prof is not able to hear me. Yes, Prof. I think Lome is receiving my sound. Thank you very much, Prof. Habele, for giving me the floor. I would like to thank once again to the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department of the African Union and CSVR for organizing this event. Would like to reiterate my apologies for not being in Lome. I was really looking forward to joining this year's Continental Forum in person, but I'm not feeling that well. Now on the my intervention, let me start with a question, and the question I think that I would like to start with is this one. When we talk and think of transitional justice, are we imagining and conceptualizing and practicing transitional justice as an all-encompassing policy framework and an all-encompassing intervention that actually covers and tries to address, if you like, all the political, socio-economic, governance, and development challenge that a society faces? I think if we imagine and conceptualize and try to practice transitional justice along those lines, then we would face a challenge as to the question of where does transitional justice start and where does transitional justice end? And this is a question about, the scope of transitional justice. I think the best approach, to my mind, for thinking about and articulating the implementation of transitional justice is in terms of how it intersects with various other issues and various other policy areas, whether that is in relation to development, whether that is in relation to peace and security, whether that is in relation to the building and rebuilding of state institutions, whether that is in relation to the reimagining and addressing the breakdown of state-society relationship in relational terms. Otherwise, it becomes anything and everything, and we couldn't get the core of transitional justice. So it is against this background that I would like us to think about the pursuit of the implementation of the African Union transitional justice policy in relation to and within the context of the various existing, but most importantly, emerging challenge on the continent. The challenge that Alan, speaking before me, identified as summarized by Prof. Habele. I think this will help us in thinking about how can we continuously adapt, not necessarily the the policy itself, but how we think about that policy would be implemented and translated into specific uh, tools and interventions in specific uh, societies uh, in specific contexts. Now, when we do this, I think it's also important to ask the question: what are the assumptions or the considerations that we need to have in terms of constraints? Constraints which actually militate against the full realization of the ambitions of the African Union transitional justice policy. I think understanding and considering these constraints would help a great deal in terms of what needs to be done in particular circumstances, since it is impossible to overcome all the constraints that the implementation of the African Union transitional justice policy would face. So let's consider the following issues. First, in terms of the socioeconomic dimensions of things, I think it's worth repeating that the African Union transitional justice policy clearly articulates what it calls socioeconomic or redistributive justice, which actually addresses the social, economic, and development inequities that the society that is in transition, has with it. And these social, economic, and development inequities then may relate to, as for example, earlier mentioned, to the question of land, It's also worth mentioning that the issue of reparative justice comes in for the loss and injury that has been experienced in the course of conflict and authoritarian rule. I think in this context, one of the things that we need to do, particularly as we conceptualize and articulate and discuss the relationship between transitional justice, I would like to speak about relationships here, the relationship between transitional justice and the ongoing policy discourse around climate change. And indeed, in that context, particularly as it relates to COP27, the debate around loss and damage. Of course, it's important that what this helps us do is link the question of loss and injury and damage that has been suffered with also the question of the past, and that is history, whether that is in the context of colonialism, because some of the issues, including those relating to land, those relating to, for example, the operation of extractive industries that Alan made reference to, are not simply matters that come into existence in the post-colonial era. Some of these issues are a continuity from the past. And that's why it's extremely important to link them with that past. So is it possible, therefore, for any society to conceptualize transitional justice and implement transitional justice intervention tools in a way that also takes into account these losses and damages? And how can we go about linking this with the climate change issue and also with the historical legacies and their continued impact on our lives today, whether in the economic sphere or in the political sphere. I think this is another important consideration. The other issue relates to, for example, I would like to speak in terms of the three, what I call the trinity of burdens that Africa has to deal with. The first burden has to do with the burden of history, the one that I made reference to. And the second burden is the burden of bad governance, and crisis of leadership that Africa experiences. And this period that we are in is a very important manifestation of the depth and breadth of this pervasive crisis of leadership on the continent that has left the continent vulnerable to all kinds of ills, whether those relating to terrorism or those relating to climate change or those relating to the COVID-19 pandemic that we have experienced. In one way or another, they relate to the leadership deficit that is undermining the agency of African countries and the African continent in order to plan for and respond to emerging crises, and indeed work on the structural issues that actually and drivers that occasion these emerging issues. So what does the implementation of transitional justice and the African Union transitional justice policy mean in this kind of setting that is characterized by a major democratic regression and pervasive failure of leadership on the continent that has created the various threats made reference to. And these threats also linked to even the deterioration of existing conflicts on the continent and the eruption of new conflicts, which actually make a mockery of the African Union's agenda on transitional justice. 20 years, as we celebrate the 20 years or anniversary of the African Union. The third burden that the African continent bears is the Africa's international standing and its position in the international power structure. And this continues to affect the continent in so many ways. During COVID, we have seen how it has affected Africa, among others, in the way the international economic and financial system operates, whether that is in relation to date, whether that is in relation to the waiver for the TRIPS agreement that would have allowed the COVID vaccine to be a truly global public good that would be available for all for responding to a genuinely global threat and pandemic that COVID-19 was. And you have seen how Africa's voices and concerns and indeed legitimate case for that has been ignored, marginalized, and undermined. And we see this in the context of also the economic measures for overcoming the impacts, the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19, whether this is in relation to the lack of providing flexibility with respect to date, for example, or whether this is in relation to the special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund. Despite the fact that Africa has the most needs, it was not Africa that was allocated these special drawing rights. It is those who are and remain much better placed. Or in relation to, for example, with respect to climate change, $100 billion have been pledged, but Africa received only about less than 4% of that so far. And it has to do with the fact that Africa is put at the bottom of the power pyramid of the international system. And of course, in the political realm, we know this relates to Africa's place in the Security Council as well. So given these circumstances, again, the question would be, what does pursuing transitional justice and implementing the African Union transitional justice policy mean under these circumstances that are actually making African societies much more vulnerable, much more weaker, and socioeconomically poorer? That is what we are experiencing. So without, I think, overcoming and finding a way of wrestling with these trinity of burdens that Africa bears, which are increasingly making the efforts for peace and security, democratic governance on the continent very fraught, I think the pursuit of the implementation of the African Union TJ policy would continue to face major headwinds. So it is therefore my submission that as we think about the transitional justice policy and its implementation, it's important to think about how it relates to these issues and what policy interventions and instruments need to be mobilized in order also to contend with these, so that in contending with these, we are able to create the conditions for the effective pursuit and implementation of the African Union transitional justice policy. Finally, Professor Habele, let me say this and conclude on the critical importance of the role of non-state centers of public power in a time when national political leaders and actors are failing to assume their full responsibility. It is increasingly important that the African Union and regional economic communities seek to empower and to work with these non-state centers of public power, including civil society organizations, independent media, professional organizations, trade unions, women groups, youth groups, peasant associations, as a way of reinvigorating state political actors, and indeed pushing and nudging them into ever increasingly assume their full responsibility, without which none of what we are trying to do can be meaningfully pursued. One last point in relation to the question whether the implementation of transitional justice starts during conflict or after conflict. I think perhaps my take would be one that says it depends on which element of transitional justice you are making reference to. If you look at the African Union transitional justice policy, it clearly makes reference to, for example, what it calls the peace process element, which actually applies during conflict. That is critical. And other elements, I think, would come to be implemented as peace agreement is established, and as part and parcel of, if you like, the reform, reconstruction of state and society in the aftermath of authoritarian rule and violent conflict. I would like to stop here and once again thank you for your kind attention. I don't think Prof. Habele was able to hear me, so can you let him know that I have stopped?
Can I proceed? Can you hear me?
Yes, Director, kindly proceed, please. Thank you.
Yes, Ambassador, you have to guide me because our original time we're supposed to, according to our original time, we're supposed to finish in the next 7 minutes. So how do I proceed?
Excellency, you have 15 more minutes, so you will end 15 after 4 p.m. Thank you.
15 after 4. Okay. Thanks a lot. You will guide me identifying the hands, the people who want to speak there. So the floor is open now. We only have until 4:15. So we have like 15 minutes or 20 minutes thereabout. Can you take the
Yes.
intervention from the
Director,
floor?
I will be your eyes here on the floor.
Yes, be my eyes and ears.
And then I hope I will be awarded so I can fly to Lesotho to receive my award.
Yes, definitely. Most definitely.
Okay, kindly get the mic here. The microphone, please. Colleagues, can we get the microphone, please? Yeah, kindly proceed. Thank you.
Les leaders sur le continent africain. Mais je voudrais faire observer que ce déficit de lien social n'est pas seulement entre les leaders, les chefs d'État et les populations, mais aussi entre les populations. Et quand vous prenez par exemple la question de la sorcellerie, c'est une question de soupçon à l'égard de tout un chacun dans la société de façon générale. Quand vous prenez la question de l'entrepreneuriat, où vous allez prendre quelqu'un de votre famille ou bien quelqu'un de la société que vous mettez devant votre entreprise, cette destruction, cette malhonnêteté qui s'ensuit, qui fait que bon, tout tombe quand vous ne surveillez pas, c'est une rupture du lien social. Alors ma question, c'est comment fait-on pour résorber ce problème? J'ai l'impression qu'on met trop de poids sur le dos de la justice transitionnelle, mais comment fait-on exactement pour sortir de là en Afrique? Comment gagner de la confiance les uns envers les autres? Voilà, merci.
Okay, merci. Can I see hands, those who want to ask questions, so we can identify? I'm not giving you the floor yet, my brother. Just raise your hand. So you are number 2. Let's give some numbers so we can then close the floor.
Okay, great.
Brother, just switch the microphone off, please. Switch it off.
Okay.
So you are number 1, number 2, no, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, 5, 5, 6, 6, any other hand? 6. So in that order, please. Kindly proceed. Merci beaucoup. But please try to be brief so we can have more time for answering the questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel, and I was quite excited about the thoughts that Mrs. Michelle Ndiaye shared around, expanding the frontiers of transnational justice to also include the protection of the civic space. Because in practical terms, the governments of states are still largely responsible for implementing TJ policies and TJ processes. And we've seen a lack of political will all across Africa. So one of the tools that's been used by the various governments is to sort of silence, agitations within the government. So the civic space is not free. It's shrinking. Civil society cannot, advance. Citizens themselves cannot, speak out. So I'm quite interested in, how we can broaden, the scope of TJ to now see the preservation of the civic space, not just as a byproduct, but as a very core and fundamental element of transitional justice. And I'll be happy to hear further thoughts that the panelists may have, especially Mrs. Michelle Ndiaye about that. Thank you very much.
Ok. Merci. Moi, je suis Diakaria Traoré du Mali. Moi, ce n'est pas une question, mais un partage d'expérience par rapport à un aspect de la justice transitionnelle au Mali, surtout avec les questions de rupture constitutionnelle, inconstitutionnelle de pouvoir. En fait, ces changements qui viennent brusquement créent des cassures dans les dynamiques. Et en général, il se trouve que les acteurs qui mettent en œuvre la justice transitionnelle, en plus de l'État, à savoir la société civile, les associations de victimes et autres, sont dans des dynamiques et qui sont brusquement arrêtés. Et il y a des changements de vision de politique de la part de nouveaux tenants du pouvoir. Ce qui fait que souvent ce sont des remises en cause. L'un des points sur lesquels nous sommes actuellement au Mali, société civile et les acteurs, les victimes et survivants, c'est la question judiciaire. Retenez que déjà de 2013 à 2022, le Mali a connu 8 ministres de la justice. 8 ministres de la justice avec lesquels chaque fois il faut revenir pour faire le plaidoyer par rapport au processus d'accès à la justice des victimes. Chaque fois qu'on commence un processus avec un ministre, il est changé. On revient une année, souvent il y a certains ministres qui n'ont même pas fait un an et ils ont été débarqués. Donc, ce qui fait qu'il est très difficile et chaque ministre qui vient vient avec une vision. On demande aux acteurs de s'insérer dans cette vision. Pendant que les gens essaient de prendre leur marque, un autre changement est opéré. Donc, il y a plusieurs plaintes qui ont été déposées entre 2014 et 2016, mais jusqu'à aujourd'hui, aucune audience réelle pour ces plaintes. Parce que non seulement les magistrats qui avaient commencé l'instruction du dossier ne sont pas restés sur place, ils ont bougé. Ensuite, il y a eu la Cour suprême qui avait transféré des pouvoirs des régions qui étaient occupées en 2012.
Could you please try to summarize, my brother? Thank you very much.
Ok. D'accord. Donc, il y a eu un certain nombre d'actions qui ont été posées et qui ont fait que ces processus ont pris du retard. Juste pour vous dire que ces ruptures inconstitutionnelles sont des freins au processus de justice transitionnelle et que la politique de justice transitionnelle, même si elle est la meilleure, elle est aussi tributaire de tous les processus internes qui sont souvent très difficiles pour sa mise en œuvre. Merci.
Number 3, please proceed.
Merci. La première remarque, c'est que ce n'est pas seulement les coups d'État qui donnent la justice transitionnelle. Il y a aussi un modèle, c'est le modèle du Maroc. C'est le même système, le même régime qui est responsable des violations graves des droits de l'homme. Il a essayé d'ouvrir la question de réconciliation avec la société. Ça, c'est un modèle avec ses avantages et ses inconvénients. D'autre part, notre professeur a posé la question pourquoi on utilise la justice transitionnelle? Moi, j'ai un petit problème avec l'appellation. Moi, je dis que c'est la justice de transition, limitée dans le temps et limitée dans les objectifs. Lorsqu'on arrive à la transition, on doit revenir à l'état de droit et au développement de la société. J'ai une question, c'est que j'ai fait à peu près l'étude de 25 commissions de la justice transitionnelle. Ma question, est-ce que la justice transitionnelle a servi seulement les États et la sécurité des États? Il n'a pas servi la société et les victimes. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Number 4, please take the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Docteur Kalipé, Université de Kara. Ce n'est pas forcément une question, mais je voudrais faire un petit apport en faisant le lien entre la justice transitionnelle et la cohésion sociale, qu'il m'est permis de faire cette analyse pour dire que la justice transitionnelle peut s'observer à 2 niveaux. D'abord au niveau national et au niveau local. C'est dans cette approche que je voudrais revenir sur l'expérience togolaise qui a consisté à la mise en place des comités locaux de paix qui sont placés sous la tutelle de Ashkroun. Et ces comités locaux de paix constituent aujourd'hui un gage de paix dans les localités, dans la mesure où ces comités sont organisés sur la base de leadership communautaire réunissant l'ensemble des communautés qui vivent dans le même milieu. Les leaders de ces différentes communautés désignés par la base elle-même qui constitue ce comité et qui a pour mission, d'abord ces comités ont fait d'abord une étude pour identifier les différents conflits de leur communauté. Ensuite, ils sont arrivés à développer cette dimension que les comités arrivent dans une première partie en amont à identifier en avance, donc dans l'alerte précoce, à identifier les différentes crises qui peuvent arriver dans les localités. Quand ces crises arrivent, ils arrivent à les régler de manière pacifique, sans toutefois faire appel à la justice processuelle. Et dans leur troisième dimension, ces comités de paix arrivent à consolider la paix dans la localité. Et tout cela se fait en union avec les exigences de la justice transitionnelle et la définition du cadre politique défini par l'État et le Ashkroun. Cette expérience, nous l'avions évaluée il y a quelques mois. Nous avions vu comment les populations se retrouvent dans ce cadre, comment les autorités locales trouvent un bénéfice dans le règlement pacifique des questions de ces localités. Je pense que c'est une très belle expérience qu'il faudrait s'approcher du Ashkroun pour pouvoir régler les questions, surtout dans la dimension de la cohésion sociale, puisque c'est à la base que ces questions de la cohésion sociale se posent véritablement. Ce n'est pas au sommet, c'est à la base. C'est tout ce que je voudrais apporter comme apport dans ce travail-là. Merci beaucoup.
Alors, next, please. The last question.
OK. Je suis Kanté Lassina, président de la Confédération des organisations de victimes des crises ivoiriennes, donc Côte d'Ivoire. Alors, je voulais vraiment tout d'abord remercier et dire merci à l'Union africaine d'avoir mis en place une politique de justice transitionnelle sur papier et donc un document de travail. Alors, je voulais savoir, après l'adoption de cette politique, quelles sont les actions que que la commission elle-même de l'Union africaine a mis en place sur le terrain, c'est-à-dire dans les différents États, pour que les directives qui y sont contenues soient réellement mises en œuvre. Je le dis parce que nous, en tant qu'organisation des victimes, nous avons bénéficié d'un financement pour vulgariser, d'un financement de notre partenaire TGLF pour la vulgarisation de cette politique-là sur le terrain, c'est-à-dire en Côte d'Ivoire. Et là, des localités étaient choisies, 4 localités. Alors, pour nous, nous devions venir en appui à l'État quant à la vulgarisation de cette politique. Mais malheureusement, nous n'avons senti aucun début d'application de cette politique. C'est vrai, quand nous sommes revenus de la crise, il y a eu, n'est-ce pas, des mécanismes de justice transitionnelle qui ont été mis en place. Mais comme le collègue du Mali vient de le dire, avec les changements, les nouvelles personnalités qui arrivent souvent ne sont même pas informées de ce qui s'est passé au préalable. Et donc souvent, il y a certains qui n'ont même pas épousé la notion de justice transitionnelle. Ils ne savent même pas de quoi on parle quand on parle de justice transitionnelle. Et nous, dans la vulgarisation de cette politique, nous avons même adressé un courrier à la représentation locale de l'Union africaine pour venir nous appuyer. Mais malheureusement, cette représentation était absente. Alors, on se demande, je me demande, est-ce qu'il y a un suivi? Est-ce qu'au niveau central, c'est-à-dire au niveau de la commission, est-ce que réellement il y a un suivi de l'application de ces politiques? Est-ce qu'il y a une évaluation qui est faite de la mise en œuvre de cette politique de justice transitionnelle dans nos différents pays? Qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Parce qu'il y a des défis réellement qui s'offrent à nous, qui se présentent à nous sur le terrain et que véritablement nous devons même peut-être trouver un appui avec ces institutions-là pour nous aider à débloquer certaines situations. Mais malheureusement, quand ça ne va pas, on ne sait pas à qui s'adresser réellement sur le terrain et ça nous cause beaucoup de soucis. Donc je voulais vraiment savoir, comment ressortir de ces assises-là, que nous ayons réellement des instruments terrain. Parce que nous, en tant qu'organisation de victimes, nous travaillons sur le terrain. Il faut que nous puissions avoir ces appuis-là au niveau institutionnel, au niveau même de l'Union africaine, pour que véritablement nous puissions faire avancer nos préoccupations sur le terrain. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. I think that was the last question for today. Now we are back to the moderator. No, we have the question from Sadek. That will be the last.
Thank you, Ambassador. Okay. Thank you very much. Panel members, thank you very much for this presentation, and to Solomon as well. My name is Javin. I represent SADC at the African Union. So I've got 2 questions for my sister from Zimbabwe and 1 comment for you, my brother, regarding Cabo Delgado. So the first one will be a thought-provoking question. As you are aware, SADC has been pushing for the removal of sanctions of Zimbabwe. It's been years. I think you expected this question from SADC. So don't you believe that if SADC had categorized this as a coup, so it would have had AU? Would these sanctions imposed, wouldn't they have been even harder or a bigger burden on the society and be a hindrance to all the efforts that have been made on TJ in your country? The representative from the Ministry of Justice of Zimbabwe has been briefing me about all the things that Zimbabwe had been doing up till now. So that would be my thought-provoking question. The second one, maybe you're not aware, we have just adopted rules of engagement with non-state actors, which provide clear criteria on how to engage with civil societies or youth organizations. So don't you believe that this recently adopted mechanism and engagement with the non-state actors, they would provide a better framework to SADC member states, including ZIM, to have parameters while engaging with CSOs and youth organizations? And then the comments on Cabo Delgado. As you know, we have SAMIM. We have the SADC standby force already intervening there, military-wise. But we also have assistance from the European Union and African Union, of course, on the early response mechanism, which is the reconstruction of Cabo Delgado. This is working hand in hand with the Mozambique government Cabo Delgado recovery plan. So I can provide a lot of information, but I don't have much time in front of me. It's capacity building for women, gender-based violence initiatives, skills knowledge of the refugees. So all these things SADC is doing as well. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jabin. We have two quick interventions, Dr. Khabali, before I give the floor back to you. We have a quick intervention from our brother Eric Simon from Côte d'Ivoire, followed by our colleague Eugene from the Department of Political Affairs. 1 minute each, please. Thank you.
Merci. Juste un petit commentaire sur l'intervention de M. Alan Ngari à propos de la justice transitionnelle et des changements politiques qui interviennent et des transitions politiques également. Est-ce que dans cette perspective, vous ne pensez pas que la vision que l'on doit avoir de la justice transitionnelle devrait être assez holistique, de sorte à ne pas attendre qu'il y ait des violences politiques, qu'il y ait des crises dans les pays, mais déjà établir un certain niveau d'alerte précoce permettant déjà de surveiller les questions de paix et de sécurité, les questions de violation massive des droits de l'homme et les questions d'entrave grave à la démocratie. Sinon, si on ne le fait pas comme ça, étant entendu que les changements inconstitutionnels de régime commencent à être malheureusement monnaie courante en Afrique et qu'à chaque fois, on se retrouve avec des régimes qui sont très peu respectueux des droits de l'homme. Et après, on parle encore de justice transitionnelle sans pouvoir finalement parvenir à l'objectif, en fait, globalement. Donc, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que ce forum devrait nous permettre de mettre en lien les questions de justice transitionnelle avec les changements inconstitutionnels de gouvernement et avec la surveillance globale des situations des droits de l'homme dans les pays concernés? Éric Sémian, je viens de Côte d'Ivoire. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'ambassadeur Salah. Je voudrais juste faire un petit commentaire. Et j'ai entendu le professeur Kabele dire qu'on pouvait appliquer la justice transitionnelle avant la crise. Je suis tenté, même s'il n'est pas panéliste, j'aimerais avoir un peu sa lumière. Je voulais juste tenter de lui poser la question de savoir pourquoi on va appliquer la justice transitionnelle là où il n'y a pas de transition. Et il a parlé du rôle de la prévention. À mon avis, je pense que la prévention, le rôle de la prévention, c'est après la crise, notamment avec les réformes. Parce que quand on discute avec les victimes, ce qu'elles veulent, c'est l'assurance qu'il n'y aura plus d'autres crises. Donc s'il y a des réfugiés, par exemple togolais, qui vont au Ghana, avant de rentrer au Togo, ils doivent s'assurer qu'il n'y aura plus de crise. Donc je vois plus le rôle de la prévention après qu'avant. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Eugene. Dr. Matlosa, we are now back to you. We are in your hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Salah. We've had 9 interventions all in all, and we have little time. Fortunately, most of those were comments. So I would like to ask my panelists to take a bite at the interventions, focus mainly on the questions. The comments were complementary to your presentations, so just focus on the questions. And I'll give each one of you just 2 minutes. 2 minutes each, just to respond to the questions that were directed to you, and then just make some final reflections, and then we close. Let's go in the same order we started the presentations, please. Starting with Ross, and then Alan, and then Solomon, in that order.
Thank you. I'm
Ross.
going to address the issue of civic space and how it can be linked to transitional justice as civil society is important. I believe that we need a binding document at the continental level. At the UN level, we do have a declaration that is looking at protecting human rights defenders. That has actually been domesticated in some of the countries from West Africa, particularly Benin and Cote d'Ivoire. They've come up with laws on protecting human rights defenders that is guided by the United Nations Declaration, although it's not binding, which is quite commendable. So at the African Union level, we need an instrument that clearly sets out the role of civil society, human rights defenders, and how states should be interacting with it, which is binding. And then there was an issue that was raised around whether it was not strategic for SADC not to declare the events of November 2017 as a coup d'etat, as that would have derailed all the transitional justice developments in the country. From my own perspective, Zimbabwe has undergone a number of transitional justice processes, but the way that the transitional justice processes have been implemented leaves a lot to be desired. What we see is that there's been a challenge in sequencing and timing of some of those processes. If you were following events for the last few weeks, Zimbabwe was subject to review by the United Nations Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And there were issues of transitional justice that Zimbabwe claims to have dealt with that were actually raised by that committee around marginalization of one of the tribes in Zimbabwe that has been subject to massacres in the early 80s, where the committee actually said they still feel that there is a lot of marginalization of that community, and yet Zimbabwe claims that they've been dealing with these processes through transitional justice processes that have not been properly sequenced and timed to address this issue and ensure that there's social cohesion in the country. And then the debate around the sanctions, which are targeted measures against certain individuals and companies. I think that's a debate for another day. Those targeted measures were imposed on Zimbabwe because of the prevailing human rights and democracy situation in the country, which if it is addressed, then those who have imposed those targeted measures will definitely lift that. Thank you.
Thanks very much for all the comments and the questions. I'm not going to address the question from Mr. Kante that was addressed to the African Union. I was very happy to hear Eugene intervene, and so I thought he was going to answer it. So please have a side chat with the people in the table behind you, 2 tables behind you, Mr. Kante, to hear about the African Union, what the African Union is doing on the ground. But just to say on that point that sometimes we place a lot of burden on an institution, and you forget that we are actually the people on the ground to make the policy work. It took a long time to get that policy adopted. It's been adopted, and now we need to put some feet to the policy. And it's us in our capacities, either at the civil society level, whether at the government level, intergovernmental level, to actually push forward what the policy is aimed at. And where there are gaps that have been identified in the policy, then how do we address those gaps? How do we then creatively together try to see how to address some of the gaps that we have identified in the policy? And speaking of transitional justice policies, I think one of the things that we get wrong in the processes of implementing transitional justice mechanisms is the idea that once we have set up truth commissions, or once criminal prosecutions have happened, or reparations programs have been implemented, or many other processes around guaranteeing non-recurrence of violence, we feel that the process has come to an end. And once the commissions and the various other mechanisms stop work, that then reconciliation has happened. And that is actually not the case. And I'm responding to the questions around the sort of holistic responses that we need in order then to ensure that our communities at all levels, whether it's intercommunally, and this is in response mostly to the question around social cohesion that was raised by the first speaker, and also to Eric around if we don't constantly monitor processes, we will get to a point where we actually need the transitional justice processes, and also to Hisham on the failures of looking at transitional justice from a holistic perspective. It is not an event, it's a process. Social cohesion, reconciliation is a process. It will take generations. I think we have learned in very many African situations. I mean, we often talk about the South African context, and many err and say that it's a model, but more and more when you look into the South African context, it's very clear that it is not a model, that there is a lot of unfinished business. The process of reconciliation does not end, it does not end with the end of a truth commission. In fact, if anything, it's just scratching the surface, and the processes of reconciliation will go on. They can be intergenerational. And I really liked the interventions that Solomon also brought about in terms of some of the issues that span the colonial days in very many African countries, and the legacies of that still 70 years later impact on the African people. And it just shows us that process of social cohesion and reconciliation will take generations, and we must continue working hard at it. I want to end by just thanking the gentleman who mentioned the work of Ashkrun and our hosts here in Togo. And we had the privilege of hearing the work of Ashkrun, but also emphasizing specifically that it is a mechanism that has been established after a TJRC that was set up in this country. And where we are going wrong as African states is that once we have established the mechanism, it ends there. The reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are never implemented. There isn't a body that is going to implement it. And we heard this morning from the interventions from our colleagues from Ashkrun about the work that they are doing to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. So it is to say that there needs that the work around reconciliation, around social cohesion, around implementing the recommendations, whether it's from a Truth Commission or even pushing forward towards criminal prosecution, has to continue after the close of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And just lastly, on access to justice for victims, I think it remains a question of political will. That is a challenge that will continue being there on the continent, but we have some really good examples. Again, we point to Togo, where we are sitting today, and hearing how the political will was present to ensure that the implementation of the recommendations of the TRC in this country happen. And I think it is a case study that we should really be talking about, and we had actually had many conversations with Ashkrun to say that the stories around this country and the processes that they have done in Togo need to be documented and need to be shared so that others can understand what follow-through mechanisms are after a transitional justice mechanism has been established. Thank you. Oh, sorry, one last thing. Thank you, Mr. Pillay, around the information on SADC and what is happening in Cabo Delgado. I think we are learning, and that's actually what we are meant to be doing. I mentioned in my intervention that one of the challenges that we've experienced in Africa is the militarization and securitization in response to violent extremism. And in Cabo Delgado, that was actually the first response that came from the Mozambican government, as well as other national and international interventions in the country. But when you point us to the capacity building exercises, for example, that are happening for women, it tells us that we are now moving away from that militarized and securitized approach. And it's really encouraging to see that it is something that we need to follow, and say that there are other tools as well that can be used to address these emerging threats beyond that militarized and securitized approach. And it is that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. The policies that we have within the transitional justice space, the practices within transitional justice can be tools that can be used to address some of these challenges. The reality is that those root drivers of that violent extremism are really much the same as those that are in conflict, and it's the push and pull factors that we have identified in violent extremism very much the same within conflict. And so there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and I'm glad to see that SADC is moving in that direction, and it's something that should be emulated in the other regions. We look forward to seeing what the work of SADC is in Cabo Delgado to end the crisis. Thanks.
Let me come
Commissioner Solomon Darso,
yes.
please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sala. Let me start off with a comment that is picking on what Alan said, which is a transitional justice, because of the circumstance in which it applies, can't be one that would fulfill all the expectations and aspirations around justice. That is the experience even of what is considered to be, quote unquote, a model experiment with transitional justice that South Africa is, illustrates to us that the lesson from that is that given the constraints in which, and the context, very difficult context, as outlined in this in the concept note and in the introduction to the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Given those constraints, the question, the strategic question that we should pose is, what is it that is realistically possible at one moment, at a moment of a particular transition, that needs to be pursued forcefully, and thereby effect a level of transformation, a level, I say, not a full transformation, a level of transformation of the power relations and structure of society, giving opportunity for a more inclusive, a more just and equitable system of governance. So in the case of South Africa, for example, it is really more about the political dimension of things. And currently there is a lot of concern that is being expressed around addressing the socioeconomic historical legacies of apartheid that's not fully addressed by the transitional justice process. So I think it's important to bear in mind, what is it that aspect of change and reform that can be effected, that can be implemented during transition, which paves the way for perhaps, laying down the ground for other additional forms of justice processes to emerge in subsequent generations. We can speak of the same thing, for example, in the context of Kenya, at least as far as what I consider to be political and institutional reform is concerned, which has been effected through the reform of the constitution and the adoption of the 2010 constitution, which with the establishment of guarantees of independence for specific institutions, is enabling an environment that is more conducive for pursuing other forms of justice as well. So I think we have to think about the implementation of transitional justice along these lines, that we can't have, it can't be an everything, an all thing or nothing approach, I think, to transitional justice, unfortunately. Of course, as I say this, I'm mindful of the dilemma that we face, which is, what if transitional justice becomes hijacked and ends up becoming an instrument for enabling the old regime and those associated with the old regime? I think there is always this danger that we face. And part of the question for us is, what is it that, we can't be able to implement under those difficult circumstances? And this brings me to the next intervention I have, which relates to the question that my brother from Cote d'Ivoire asked. How do we link transitional justice with the unconstitutional change of government and the military coups that happened. And here, and indeed, it is an important issue, and there is direct relationship between transitional justice and these military coups and the transitional process that they have triggered. Because one of the questions that we need to ask, whether it is in Sudan, whether it is in Chad, whether it is in Mali, Guinea, or Burkina Faso, there are political transitions that are unfolding. And part of the question that we need to ask is, how do we now take advantage of these political transitions to make use of the tools in the African Union transitional justice policy in order to bring about the relevant and necessary reforms in these countries, such that these countries wouldn't have the same experience that they are having now. Because remember, in Mali, for example, they are having the third coup since 2012. And this is despite the fact that there was election and everything. And that gives rise to the question of the fact that the reforms necessary in the security sector, in the realms of state institutions, have not been effectively implemented. And there are useful resources in the African Union transitional justice policy that can be appropriated in order to effect the kind of reform and change that would make it possible for these countries to break the vicious cycle of recurrent military coups. So that is, the other point that I thought was mentioning in relation to the current reforms. So the challenge for the African Union and us all is how to think about using the African Union transitional justice policy in these political transitions that are unfolding in these countries in the context of unconstitutional change of government. I think let me stop here, and once again, thank you all very much for your kind attention. And just one last point before I say it. The African Union transitional justice policy provides for it has two major blocks. One is the process or the procedure block. The other is what we call the content block. In the procedure block, there is a specific requirement that the implementation of transitional justice processes requires that there are guarantees of freedom of expression, freedom of association, in order to allow victims and other members of society to actively participate in the process of the formulation as well as implementation of transitional justice processes. And therefore, the question of the civic space is one of the prerequisites for the implementation of transitional justice process. And indeed, as far as legal tools and instruments is concerned, I think it's a matter of really African governments and institutions adhering to and complying with existing legal instruments, including, for example, relating to Article 9 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on freedom of expression, or Article 10 relating to freedom of association, which actually protect the civic space. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you, Rose, for your intervention as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Commissioner. Back to you, Prof.
Thank you. Let me thank the panelists once again. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I would like to thank them most sincerely and thank Ambassador Salah for being my eyes and ears on ground in Lomé. Let me wind it up with two main takeaways from this discussion. One is that it is not, actually the AUTJ policy is very clear. It emphasizes context specificity. So the policy will be implemented according to the context in which it is being applied. So we cannot, for example, talk about the TJ being applicable only to post-conflict situations or during conflict situations. Let it be applied anywhere, anytime, provided the context allows, the context is conducive. So I want to bring in the issue of context specificity, because once you bring the context specificity, then we will not be compelled to say you can implement a TJ from this point A to point Z. No, we can't prescribe like that. It will be implemented anytime, anywhere, provided the context allows. So let's allow ourselves to agree with that principle in the policy itself of context specificity. That's number one. Number two, the whole question around the nexus between TJ and social cohesion is an important discussion. It's an important discussion. And I think the focus on social capital has helped us to discover that nexus between TJ and social cohesion. And by extension, the nexus between TJ and social contract. So I think it's important that we have touched on these issues, because they also remind us of the African tradition, the African culture, you know, which is dying if we're not careful as Africans. The African culture of, you know, humaneness, humanity. In Southern Africa, we talk of Ubuntu. You know, that principle, that concept says, I am because we are. We are because I am. And that's the platform upon which we build social bonds as Africans. Social cohesion is solidified around those kind of African, you know, way of life, of Ubuntu, you know, of solidarity, you know, that Africans were a community, basically. So these are important principles, and they are all covered in the TJ policy. So for me, what is important is that, one, TJ policy is context specific, but two, it is important that our forum on focusing on social capital has brought to light the strong linkage between TJ on one hand and social cohesion on the other, and between TJ and social contract. And with those remarks, I would like to bring our session to the end. I'm sorry that we took longer than we had planned, but I think it was worth it. We had a very rich discussion. I would like to thank the organizers for this and hand over peacefully and constitutionally back to Ambassador Salah.
Professor,
thank you so much.
I'm very glad that you are handing over peacefully. Otherwise, there will be an attempt. You can hear me, Prof? Well, I think there's a problem, but I'm sure you'd agree with me, ladies and gentlemen, that our professor and his member of the panel, the panelists, deserve a very loud and sound round of applause. Yeah. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our first day. I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, need some rest, so we can come back tomorrow exactly at 9 o'clock to begin our second day. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and please try to take some coffee and tea before you go home or you go back to your room. I'm not sure if there's colleagues, if there's any announcement. No announcement. Fantastic. Merci beaucoup and have a nice afternoon, please. Thank you.